massive steel stanchion and a huge piggyback. The Suntour Voro is a classic mono style shock with an IFP piggyback. To put this in plain English, a mono style essentially means the oil only has one path to flow. What this does is it makes the shock more reliable, it makes it more simple, less moving parts, and you're not going to have a whole bunch of adjustments like a Fox Float X2. An IFP piggyback basically means it's like most shocks on the market, and it's very simple. The massive piggyback comes in about 4 inches and that many centimeters, so be careful because you could have some potential fitment issues with this shock on your bike. The Suntour Voro features 16 clicks of rebound. Like I said, the mono style limits the external adjustments, but the shock's so easy to take apart, it wouldn't be too hard to tune it later. The Voro features 6 clicks of low speed rebound. So there's not a whole bunch of information on the Voro or video, so I emailed Suntour and this is what I got back. We got an oversized 14mm steel stanchion, so fear not on your long yoke specialized bikes. Now, John couldn't be 100% certain that it wasn't going to break, but I decided to send it because of that large steel shaft. The clicks are super defined on the compression, and the manufacturing that Suntour does on their higher end products is pretty darn impressive. So I essentially traded my Fox suspension for this stuff, so I decided to give it a good thorough test. So the IFP on the piggyback goes from 180 to 300 psi. I was a little bit concerned because my IFP here only had 126 psi, essentially meaning it was 60 psi low. So the air pressure within the piggyback helps the oil to stay in oil and not get cavitated like the X2. But let me tell you about my first ride on the Voro, because it didn't go very good, because right here I ended up pumping it up to like 300 psi, and let me tell you how it went. With the IFP pumped up to 300 psi and a 600 pound spring, the shock was absolutely garbage. It felt like I was oversprung and then undersprung and going through all the travel, and I was like, yeah, I would expect this from a $400 shock. In an attempt to save the day, I opened the spring as much as I could and opened the compression, and it actually made it worse. After my first ride, I was pretty disappointed. I was like, wow, this shock really does suck. But remembering I had the IFP to 300 in the beginning of the ride, I decided to let the pressure down to 180 and take it out for a ride. Now, taking the shock out at 180 psi in the piggyback with the 600 pound spring on my most familiar Blue Flow trails, I was completely blown out of the water. I'm pretty sure this is the best shock that's ever been on my bike. And remember, this shock cost $399, effectively making it the cheapest shock that's ever been on my bike. And remember, from this email, if you read it closely, John from Suntour says, hey, don't go above 220 and you are just gonna have the most amazing ride. Had to stuff this in the front of the video because it's so important. So back to the normal program of boring tech stuff. The Suntour Voro damper weighs 15 ounces, that's 425 grams with no spring. If you're a cheap ass like me with a steel spring, it's gonna come in about 1 pound, 10 ounces, and that many grams. So I couldn't figure this out for the life of me because this was a used shock. So basically this large spacer thing was on my shock with a DVO coil. So DVO makes this little spacer thing so you can run smaller springs on a bigger shock. If you look at the Suntour website, it tells you the correct shock to ride or the correct spring, and the 230x65 takes a 2.8 inch long spring, so they tell you which spring to ride. So double checking the marketing, we do have a 13.99 millimeter steel stanchion, and you can tell it's steel just from that look. The aluminum stanchions are usually black. Now holding the Suntour Voro shock in your hand, you're like, is this a bicycle shock? It kind of feels like it came off a CR250. It's literally like a motorcycle shock, they just stuff into bicycles. Really awesome if you have a 57 pound e-bike, Maybe not the best if you have a light duty trail bike, but who knows? So we're back to pre-first ride. Always stuff that coil shock or any shock in your bike and take a good gander at it, because it's always awesome to have a new shock. But don't forget to depress the suspension and look for frame contact. All clear on this one. For all the Specialized owners out there, I got a little piece of advice. So you see that bottom out bumper deflecting? That is kind of a buckling force that can help snap the coil shock. So you want to make sure you're on too heavy of a spring rather than too light. Correctly sprung is actually correct. So we're looking at a Fox Float X2 bumper, and we can see it's essentially the same thing, but it's hidden inside the air shock. Taking a look at every single coil shock on the market, we can see Suntour and Marzocchi are on the very bottom, and they're the absolute cheapest shocks. The one differentiating thing from the Suntour one, it has a 14mm steel stanchion. Now the Suntour native coil spring only goes to 550 pounds, and it's on the expensive side at $90. That usually comes with a weight benefit for having such a high price. I'm not completely certain because I got a used shock from some random guy. So my used Vora came with a DVO 450 pound spring and that little spacer thing on the table. So if you have smaller springs, just order that little spacer from DVO and save yourself a bunch of money. But make sure that spacer goes on the top of the spring and you're going to be set. Well, I wasn't about forking out $90, and I just happened to have a 600 pound Fox spring in my quiver. And it doesn't quite fit into the Suntour clips. It's a little bit too small for it. The Fox spring was so close to fitting, I decided to take some files and file the paint off the inside of the Fox spring, and let me tell you, it fits on the Suntour coil after you file the paint off. So measuring sag by yourself on a coil shock is never fun, but you can get the job done with a couple online calculators I linked in the description. So this is the reason you ride a coil shock. It's just absolutely supple off the top. Everyone's favorite quote. In steep, wet, rooty trails, the coil shock absolutely shines. It needs no introduction. But the Suntour Voro is extra special because it's a very slow moving shock, allowing the bike to grip more of the ground, and you're just gonna feel extremely confident. This is what really caught me off guard. You would think this massive motorcycle shock would compromise you on the jumps, but no. Its slow moving, very predictable nature is just absolutely a beast in literally every type of trail I've ever took it on. It allows me to ride safer and faster than any air shock I've ever been on. And don't forget, the thing costs $400. Now, do you have a Specialized Kenevo? Well, I can 1000 recommend this shop. I can't tell you it's going to be super good on a Levo, a 210x55 trail bike, but this is the best shock that's ever been on my bike, and it's the absolute cheapest one. But this had me thinking, if a $400 coil shock is this amazing, what would a $1,000 one do? Well, you have to click the video on the screen because I'm going to go back to back same day on an EXT coil and this Suntour Voro.